It's my pleasure to introduce you our next speaker, Professor Alexander Dawson. Alec, he is based in Canada. He's a professor of history in the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and he has authored 3 books. The most recent book is addressing peyote and racial issues, indigeneity and whiteness related to peyote. It's a manuscript. It's not out yet. It's a very promising book, and we're all very curious to read it. And he's going to share here with us some of the thoughts that he's addressing in this book. So it's original material, and we're really happy to have him here. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Ria. Thank you. I'm on. First of all, thank you for coming back. I'm a professional historian, and we are used to settings where the minute somebody says, oh, the historian's about to speak, everybody flees. Because they assume that whatever they're going to say is going to be so unbelievably boring and uninteresting that they would much rather get coffee. And I'm going to try not to reinforce that notion in you in the next 20 minutes or so as I address some issues that I'm thinking about. First, thank you, Bia. Thank you for the people from MAPS. This has been an absolutely fascinating conference, listening to the people speak yesterday and today, and I'm looking forward to the things that I'm hearing, that I'll be hearing later today and tomorrow, to hear about the things that people care about in terms of the role of psychedelics in society, both in the plant medicine track and the other tracks. There's 3 particular things that I've been listening to and that I've been hearing a lot about that directly tie to the things that I care about or that my book is about. One of them has to do with this long continuing struggle over the legal status of psychedelics, peyote being one of them. And I want to talk a little bit about the way in which we talk about the process of legalization, particularly a kind of argument that people on the science side have, and have been actually having for more than a century, in which they say, if we just prove the therapeutic efficacy of these drugs, or prove that they're not dangerous, that they're not damaging to bodies, surely policy will follow and they will be legal. And I want to say, no, that's not the case. Because policy is not about rationality. Policy is not about evidence. Policy is about something else that I want to talk a little bit about. And I just want to put it on the table because I think it's a conversation for us to have. A second and very sort of difficult conversation that has been going on and that continues to go on, and this is thanks largely to Bia's effort to integrate different voices in this conversation, is a conversation about the notion of appropriation. What does it mean when people from non-indigenous contexts get interested in things that indigenous people curate, cultivate, and consider sacred? I want to say something about that I hope is meant simply to be a suggestion, an idea, a thought that has been based upon a decade of thinking about these issues. Certainly nothing definitive, but that I hope maybe I can help us move a conversation forward in a productive way rather than a way that encourages further conflict. And the third is this thing that I think is always unspoken here, and is certainly unspoken within the audience, or is sort of manifested in the sort of corporeality of the audience, the people here. And that is that we're talking about something that is intensely personal, right? We're talking about something that is rooted in personal experiences of healing and self-exploration and self-realization. But we are also talking about something that is intensely political. In a moment, we live in a moment, and I find it very interesting that we live in a moment, and please forgive me for getting political. Nobody said I couldn't get political, so I'm going to get political for a second. Where we are governed by a president. Now, I say we. I live in Canada at the moment, but I go back and forth between the United States, and in many ways, the United States is my home. We live with a president who, I'll just say, maybe some of you don't think, I think he's batshit crazy, right? And who is sober as a judge, who there are allegations that back in the 1980s he was a bit of a speed freak. Those are only allegations. But what we know from the evidence is that sobriety, at least his version of sobriety, a capacious appetite for diet soda, but an absolute refusal to imbibe in what he considers to be intoxicating substances, is part and parcel of his notion of what propriety is, right? The sober, disciplined body, that is the subject of the West, that is not subject to intoxicants and that must punish all bodies that are somehow not as sober and as disciplined and as ordered in his bizarre way, but ordered as he considers his body to be disciplined. So So these three conversations, I hope I haven't offended you yet. I want to speak a little bit to all three of them. First of all, my larger project is about the history of race and indigeneity and peyote. And one of the things that it's about that, I don't actually come to this originally as somebody who was particularly interested in psychedelics. My original interest was in understanding the rights and place of indigenous peoples in the Mexican nation state. I'm a historian of Mexico, although I've become a historian of the United States in recent years. And the reason that I came to this is because it strikes me that the history of prohibitions against peyote. Peyote, by the way, first drug outlawed in the history of the Americas. Yoo-hoo! 1620. 1620, outlawed by the Spanish Inquisition. And there is a history of peyote prohibitions from 1620 to the present. There are periods when the state disappears. You don't care about this. I know you don't care. I care about this. You don't care about this. When the colonial state disappears, so do the prohibitions. The prohibitions get revitalized in the late 19th century. But the weird thing about that prohibition is that from 1620 to the Drug Control Abuse, or the Drug Abuse Amendments of 1965, the Drug Control Act of 1970, those prohibitions in both Mexico and the United States, when they are enacted, have always been profoundly written in terms of race. The 1620 prohibition, and this is like, again, this is a very geeky historian thing. Some historians of the United States who write about the Inquisition in Mexico miss a really salient fact about the Inquisition, is that the prohibition in Mexico in 1620 was not a prohibition against indigenous peoples taking peyote. It was only a prohibition against what we called castas and Spaniards, that is to say, people of European ancestry and people of mixed race ancestry from taking peyote. If you fast forward to today, and I know it's many centuries, but since most of you don't care about history, I think I can do that. If you fast forward to today, we still live in an era where race defines the right to consume peyote federally in this country. When peyote became illegal in 1966, interestingly, peyote becomes illegal before mescaline, but that's a whole different story. When peyote becomes illegal in the United States, it is specifically not prohibited for members of the Native American Church only if they are 1/4 Indian by blood. This follows from a series of regulations and laws in Texas, where the state of Texas passed laws allowing members of the Native American Church to partake in peyote and to possess peyote, but only if they had 1/4 Indian blood. It's kind of a complicated legal morass, in part because most of the peyote in the United States originates in Texas. It makes it difficult for non-Native members of the Native American Church to participate in peyote legally across the country. I was struck when I did my work of the way in which that history of race, the fact that racial proscriptions from the 16th century and racial proscriptions from the 21st century are basically the same. Now, in the 16th century and through much of the 20th century, the argument that underlined that racial proscription was basically this. In the 16th century, it's like, okay, indigenous peoples, they're not yet Christian, they're kind of heathen, they can't be expected to be responsible. We hope that one day they become incorporated into civilization, but because they're kind of heathen, some of them are cannibals, they're children. They can't be held accountable for what they do. So because they can't be held accountable for what they do, the Spanish Inquisition can't go after them. But Spaniards and castas, people that were called gente de razón, or people of reason, we can go after them and we'll punish them. Interestingly enough, and this is a long history that is often forgot, there were over 80 trials in colonial Mexico, and there were a lot of castas and Spaniards who found peyote really, really interesting, a subject of great desire. Into the 20th century, those prohibitions were written in slightly different ways. Going from one of indigenous peoples not being Christian, it became a prohibition that first centered around the idea that indigenous bodies are somehow different than non-indigenous bodies, that indigenous bodies were closer to nature, that indigenous bodies were somehow more mystical, that indigenous bodies were in fundamental essentially different than non-native bodies. A lot of that assumption is that indigenous bodies are more degenerated, are inferior to non-native bodies. And because they are all these things that categorize them as different, a different set of laws can and should apply to them. Peyote becomes, in this setting, very dangerous to white bodies, right? Very dangerous to bodies that are modern, that are part of culture, that should be disciplined, that should be ordered. But in fact, peyote in this setting sort of make sense in the indigenous body, because in the view of lawmakers, in the view of members of the church, in the view of missionaries, in the view of many sort of men of authority in both Mexico and the United States, the distinction between the ordered white body and the disordered indigenous body was one that was how they organized their world. How do you know that you're white unless you are not indigenous? A white body, the disciplined, ordered body, is the categorical opposite of the mystical, irrational indigenous body. And what better way to show that than by the fact that indigenous peoples take peyote and non-indigenous peoples don't? Except for the fact that throughout the 19th and 20th century, it has been states, the United States government and the Mexican government, missionary groups, scientists, experts of all sorts, who have been actively trying to ensure that that boundary gets policed. And the way that they police that boundary is by not just saying indigenous bodies should have licit peyote and non-indigenous bodies should not, but by erasing or disciplining or punishing non-indigenous bodies that are attracted to and that desire the effects of peyote. A brief aside in that narratives about what is sometimes called peyote intoxication. I can, but can I just finish the points that I was going to make, because I have a very limited amount of time. But I'd like to finish the points that I make, and then I can come back to your question, if that's all right. I mean, I think that I basically agree with you, but I have a couple of points that I wanted to make along the way. Is that all right? Okay. Let me get the idea of peyote intoxication. One of the reasons why it has always been so threatening to Western authority is not because it is a body that is intoxicated in the way that alcohol intoxicates a body or the way that opiates intoxicates a body. Not because it is a body that loses control, but because it is a body that is beyond control. It is a body that has a will of its own. It is a body that doesn't obey the traditional separation, at least that is at the core of Western ideology, between man and nature, between body and mind, and it sort of disrupts a lot of things that are at heart the sort of core concepts of Western medicine. That idea, that feature of the effect of peyote has always then been written in terms of this understanding of peyote being something that should be relegated to the indigenous realm and should not be tolerated in the non-indigenous realm. Now, the point that I was trying to make a moment ago, and that I want to come to, because I want to shift and talk a little bit about something that is difficult to talk about, that I think that needs to be talked about, is the point about appropriation, and I think hopefully comes to the question that you were raising, is that this is a history from the 16th century to the 21st century in which a lot of non-indigenous peoples have consumed peyote. There is this long and important history there. There is also a history, especially in recent times, especially around the ecological crisis that a number of people have talked about, that Stacey talked about a little bit, that Kevin's talked about, and that others are going to talk about today. An ecological crisis along the border where there is less and less and less peyote available. There has been a growing concern, there is a growing concern, that non-native use of peyote, which was once described as charlatanism, which once was described as heretism or heretic behavior, that was once described as foolish, idiotic behavior, that was once described as degenerate behavior, is now being described as appropriation. Now, I believe that there are moments where something that we call appropriation does actually happen. Diana Negrin, I don't know Diana, but I see her on the panel. You're going to talk a little bit later today. She's written these wonderful critiques of certain individuals who maybe you'll mention, but I'm not going to mention, who have absolutely sought to appropriate Wiharitare culture and sell it and package it and sell themselves as indigenous shamans, right? People who take another person's culture and who use claims to insider status in that culture to then empower themselves and enrich themselves as somehow representatives or able to embody that culture, and then do it in a way that actually benefits themselves and does not benefit members of that community, in fact, actively hurts members of that community. I think that term appropriation is entirely useful to describe what happens there, especially in this day and age, and this is a sort of an arcane academic argument, when culture is so often understood as property. Nowadays we often treat culture as property in ways that previous generations didn't treat culture as property. But I think that inasmuch as that is a useful term, one of the really important things about that conversation about cultural appropriation is that those who are appropriating culture in this way are often appropriating something that doesn't actually exist. They're appropriating an idea of what it is to be indigenous that has always been central to the Western imagination. An essentialized idea, what this brilliant scholar Phil Deloria once called playing Indian. They're playing Indian by imagining that they're embodying something that never existed. In the long history of non-native attraction to peyote, there is some of that. But there is also an incredibly important and often undiscovered history of people who are engaged in something else. Something that you might call cultural exchange, something that you might call life in the contact zone, something that you might call learning, in which individuals enter into not just the use of these plant medicines, but actively seek to position themselves as students. Students of doctors, of experts, who understand something about these plants and about their relationship to set and setting and about their relationship to human experience, and try and learn from those teachers, try and learn from those indigenous teachers without themselves becoming indigenous. They seek to engage in an exchange where they are transformed, sometimes where their teachers are also transformed, but where that transformation does not involve making a claim to represent or speak on behalf of or own that thing which is owned by someone else. There was a memorial, not a memorial, but a brief celebration of the life of a Mexican psychiatrist named Salvador Roquette yesterday. I want to finish just talking very briefly about him. He was one of those people. He had a long-term relationship with a series of shamans, not just in the Sierra Mazateca, but in the Sierra Huichola. He always thought of himself as a psychiatrist. He always, for the most part, undertook his practice in Mexico City. His patients were not indigenous, but he spent about 25 years studying with and working with people like Maria Sabina, trying to understand, trying to be a student, to take knowledge that existed in some other context and make that knowledge legible and important in his own context. I think that's a really important thing. And I think that is a thing that we should not deny, even while we should also not deny the importance of the ecological challenge in both Viracocha and in the Peyote Gardens of South Texas. We should not ignore the challenge of those who say you cannot appropriate these traditions and represent them as yourselves. But I think we need to make a space. We need to make a space for those who are interested in being students, those who are interested in exchange, and those who see in these substances something that is not just about their personal growth, but that is critically important in thinking about the whole way we have constructed Western consciousness at a moment of profound crisis in Western consciousness. And I'm done. So thank you very much. Maybe you can restate your question, and if I didn't answer it, I can try and answer it better. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't really see.
I'd like to encourage the people that want to make comments in the session of questions and answers and not shout them from the public, because we have a protocol and it's disturbing for the speaker and he can lose his concentration. And, you know, it's a conference and it's what we can, and we're trying to do our best. We do want to hear all the comments, and I apologize in advance for the selection criteria and the hierarchies and a lot of other inherent problems in doing this kind of enterprise. But we're trying to advance a discussion. So I want to invite Rosa to come and maybe make her comment here do you want to come and make your question? Just please avoid interrupting the speaker. I think he, lost a little bit of his line of
Oh,
thought.
no, I'm always disorganized.
Okay, how's that? No, do you mind being filmed, and you don't want to be filmed? Because it's...
First I want to say, to me what's interesting is this is not a panel discussion.
Yeah.
If they talk about checking your white privilege, invite the voices, because I felt very insulted by reading your description on the internet, and the way you presented it. You didn't bring up that because of enslavement of the people, they wanted to keep the indigenous people down in the mission system. And they talked about, and it's written and it's documented, the Spanish said that peyote gave the indigenous people visions. It made them powerful. So that is why it's pushing people down. That's part of the race problem. And can we approach this from a different perspective, and a perspective that humanizes, that a perspective that honors the people, that this is not just, it's not a drug to us, it's medicine. It honors our culture, that thousands of years of tradition. There's a lot here that you did not bring up, and it's your worldview and your perspective, and that's why to include a diversity of voices, and for you to be pushing, this is in my book, those things, that capitalism, the commodification, these are the critiques I have of it is a race problem. Because people who don't understand the spirit of it, they bring their worldviews of capitalism, individualism. It's not about community. It's not about community healing. And so, this is just a little bit, but...
Yeah. Let's give it back to me. Look, first of all, it was Bia that mentioned my book, not me. It was... to be honest, I'm not trying to sell you a copy of my book. Bia mentioned my book. I didn't mention it. I have a limited amount of time to speak. And when you say you're offended by the description of my talk in the catalog. There's a couple things that I want to say. I mean, we all make individual choices about what we foreground when we give a talk. We have to, right? We have a limited amount of time. But I think it's interesting that you make assumptions about me or about what I believe or what I value when I haven't told you that this is what I believe or what I value. So you want to make accusations about what I think or how I approach this. I wish you would make those accusations based upon things that I have actually said rather than things that I haven't said. Because I agree actually fundamentally with your points. I'm talking about a little slice of something that I can talk about in 20 minutes. And that it's not a panel discussion, you're right. That panel discussions would be ideal. I don't have any power in terms of organizing this conference. I was invited to speak for 20 minutes, and that's the power that I have, is to speak for 20 minutes. I think that a plurality of voices on a panel is a great idea. I think it's a fabulous idea. But I would just suggest that you think I don't think that I'm as in opposition to what you're talking about as what you're suggesting. And I just simply want to introduce into this audience a conversation where we remember that yes, you are absolutely right, that this is a sacred medicine, and it is a sacred medicine for different groups and has been historically in various different points. I think that it's actually also been a sacred medicine for non-native groups. I think that it has a much more complicated history that often gets erased. And I'd like to have that conversation. I'd like to have that conversation not be one of accusations, but rather be one where we see commonality. I hope that that's
the mic is open for comments. If people want to come and make questions and comments, we have a small amount of time. And I would also love to have a peyote panel here. I would love that we could have a big conference about things. I would like to live in the Bay Area and promote this kind of conference. So your feedback is welcome.
So I have a question. I'm kind of...
sorry, it's right here. I don't know what happened to that mic. It's here. I'm sorry.
This is not working?
No, I hear it.
No, but we're taking the questions right
like
here. What
so
happened there? No, you can take that mic down. We're taking the questions here. Sorry. It was a confusion.
Oh, yeah. So my question is about how do you feel, like not really thinking, but feeling when you kind of taking into consideration the Western culture is pretty unsustainable. And so I'm kind of curious about like how it's become an unsustainable medicine. It's no longer financially sustainable for sometimes Native people to use. They can't access it because white folks are coming in and buying it up. It's not being grown. It's not environmentally sustainable, and it's not sustaining the original culture.
Yeah.
So how do you feel like when you take those things
I think this is
into
a really
consideration?
complicated question, and it's an important question. First of all, the pressure on the peyote gardens of South Texas is in part actually derived from the growth of the Native American church in North America. It's not simply non-natives using it. I think that peyote is very difficult to cultivate, and it is very easily damaged. Stacy, her image of the tractor is very important. It's been under threat in Wirakuta as well. I think that there are groups that are endeavoring to cultivate peyote. And it's a very difficult task, but I mean, given the demand and interest, I think that supporting efforts to cultivate peyote in specific sites, it might be an answer to that question. I don't mean to dismiss any of them. The Peyote Way Church of God, which somebody asked a question about before, has been trying with relatively little success for about 25 years to grow peyote in the Aravaipa Desert of southern Arizona. I don't think there's an easy answer. How do I feel? I feel terribly worried about Western civilization. I think that, but I've always felt terribly worried about Western civilization. I don't think there's such a thing as Western civilization, but I think we're in a moment, we're in a convulsive moment of coming apart. And part of the ways in which we're coming apart is that I think that those who are doubling down on a certain kind of version of ourselves, capitalism, if you will, are doubling down on a version of that is a very dangerous idea of man's domination over nature, of turning nature into a commodity, of thinking only about material wealth. And yes, I do think that one of the things I've seen in the people that I've studied as I've done this project is that there's a remarkable tendency amongst people who've had an interest in psychedelics to think about that very thing, like what is the relationship of humans in nature, and to sort of have that kind of notion of humans and nature being sort of separate and man dominating nature, have that notion sort of exploded. This is why Ken Kesey wanted to dose all of San Francisco with LSD, and in my moments of craziness, I want to dose the entire Republican Congress, but I would not do that, and that is not a threat. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry.
We're just going to have all the people make their questions very fast, and you make one final comment because we're over time. So I want to hear the questions. It's just going to be a question, and he's going to make one final comment. You don't have time.
One syllable. Yes or no?
So I'm thinking, as someone who has access to other psychedelics that may be more sustainable, and someone who doesn't need cultural access to something as traditional as peyote and doesn't live in that region, this is not something that I plan to do because I don't need to just check things off my psychedelics list. That seems like the most ethical choice at this point. What do you think?
Yes.
No, está bien, está bien. I don't really have a question, so I don't know if I can just make a comment. I think the challenge brought to us by all this that we've been discussing, and there's a lot more to discuss on the subject. I think you bring light into something that relates not just to peyote, but also to ayahuasca and the globalization of the medicines and where this pharmacy comes from, who were the original, say, discoverers of how these technologies can benefit us. I believe that the plants are a human, patrimony of humanity, but I also believe that it is important in the order of things to respect the tribes and the indigenous knowledge that come with these plants that are already the teachers of how best to relate to them. And I think the plants can maybe heal our racial wound that we have collectively. I'd like to have a personal conversation with you and discuss some points about, prohibition of peyote.
Certainly.
But the race is very important, yes.
And Armando is holding a session on his peyote conservation project in the film screening. You can find it on the program and sign up there.
One final thing, I think the race issue has also had to do with sustainability and rampant colonialization. So.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. A big clap to Alec Dawson.
Thank you all for coming out. Thank you.